about this really interesting character early on in Islam who was a monotheist before Muhammad. This guy could have been one of the pivotal men who influenced Muhammad in his journeys.
Islamic tradition acknowledges that, but around Mecca and Medina and the Hijaz region, a few individuals are mentioned and named, but not many. The epigraphic evidence that we have from Arabia, and this is sort of an increasing corpus of evidence, clearly shows that monotheism in all of its forms was very much present in Arabia.
Quran itself engages with Jewish and Christian sacred traditions. So, this shouldn't be, whoa, what? And I've heard some people who are being critical try to say, well, when we have Gog and Magog, this region in the north of Mesopotamia that are found in the Quran, they will argue that this is pointing toward the evidence that the Quran must have come from north, way outside of this area, up there.
Quite often people think that Arabia is somehow disconnected from the wider world, but it's actually they are so important regions. Syria, Iraq, to the north, Iran, and then to the south, we have in the southern Arabia, we have Yemen, and on the other side of the Red Sea, we have Ethiopia, an important Christian country since the 4th century. So there were various places where these narratives could have come from.
Unlisted or unclassified Christian and Jewish, written in Sabbaic and Paleo-Arabic. What category would you say best fits this prophet, this figure? But I'm wondering about the evolution, and I'm also wondering about Allah's evolution. Where did these gods come from? What are your thoughts?
These deities, Allah and Al-Uzza in particular, two female deities, very well known in very early pre-Islamic epigraphic evidence. Definitely something that people worshipped in up to the maybe 3rd century Common Era. When we see in the epigraphic evidence between 400 and 600 Common Era, any sort of religious content is monotheistic, and the god is always a male god, and he is called with the name Allah or Al-Ilah or Ar-Rab, meaning the Lord.
Interesting. And what's the oldest evidence we have of the name of Allah in some form that we could identify it as that God in history? Is there a pre-monotheistic context in which this God is identified?
Yeah, there certainly is, as in particular in the Safavidic inscriptions.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today, we're going to be diving into pre-Islamic monotheism with an academic who specializes in this area, Dr. Ilkka Lindstedt. Welcome to MythVision, my friend.
Thanks a lot, Derek. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You sent me a few maps before we ended up starting this whole thing and said, let's discuss this. These areas on this map we're going to look at in a moment cover monotheism in its various forms, from Jewish thought, Judaism, Christian thought, Christianity. Then there's this red stuff we'll get to, and that's got me itching to ask you questions. But before we do, can you tell us a little bit of your expertise, your background, introducing yourself to our audience since you've never been on MythVision before, and about this book that you wrote, Muhammad and His Followers in Context?
Right. So I'm from the University of Helsinki. I'm lecturer in Islamic theology here. And so I work on various topics, especially early Islam, pre-Islamic Arabia, history of religion, basically, but, and religious groups and their connections and, interplay in late antiquity is definitely my specialty. The book, Muhammad and His Followers in Context, that came out last year, there are various arguments that I put forward, but one of them is that Arabia on the eve of Islam was much more monotheist than previously thought. So we have tangible evidence of Jews and Christians in various parts of the peninsula, and also we have an increasing number of unclassified monotheist inscriptions, unclassified in the sense that their authors, their engravers, they sort of subscribe to the belief in the one God, but they do not mention or signal any specific religious identity. So, and various interpretations can be put forward on the basis of this material. Perhaps some people who engraved these unclassified monotheist inscriptions were Jews, others Christians, and then we possibly also have some pagan monotheists there as well.
Interesting. That's a strange mix of words to use there when you come from my kind of area of thinking. Pagan monotheist? There can't be a pagan monotheist. We got to get there. But before we do, if you can afford it, it's worth picking up this book. I know that it's a academic publication. So you know how a lot of academic presses, they have a higher price on some of these books. What is this book that you wrote addressing?
Yeah, basically the religious groups and changes in late antiquity. So yeah, I start around 300 Common Era and I end around 700 Common Era. What has been sort of common and conventional in the field in the past has been to divide the history of Arabia into pre-Islamic period and early Islamic period, or Islamic period, later Islamic periods as well, of course. And that is problematic, I think, and it implies at least, or explicitly states this sort of division, that what came before Islam was totally different from what was the case after or during the Islamic era. And that does not seem to be the case. Like I mentioned, monotheism was very much present in Arabian Peninsula already. Various ethical reasonings and discourses were going on there. Mecca appears to have been some sort of local pilgrimage site already in pre-Islamic times. So what happens with the coming of Islam and the mission of the Prophet Muhammad is piecemeal change, so slow change. And these Jewish and Christian groups that exist in pre-Islamic times, they still exist in early Islamic times. So people do not convert to Islam very quickly. And those Jews and Christians were not expelled from Arabia. There's this myth of that there were a lot of various expulsions happening of Jews and Christians and forced conversions of Jews and Christians into Islam, but at least we have some evidence that there were still Jews and Christians around the year 1000 and even close to Medina, for instance.
That's an interesting thing. I think as we enter into this, we might as well address the traditional view that is probably commonly held. And your point is that was what the position even was held within academia. If I'm not mistaken, even going back to like Patricia Crone and her ideas, right? She's still using and working. There's this radical shift. And she, I think in one of her lectures is kind of using Abraham or Moses and other characters to say, there's this radical elbow that takes place in history where change happens. And there is this revolutionary, charismatic leader who does a complete 180 for everything that was going on during the day. And as we're looking at it closer, if we were to go to a closer example of Christian examples of the whole world's pagan and now the whole world is a Christian, the sleepers of Ephesus, which I think some academics have highlighted that it looks like the Quran is at least aspired to have a story in there about this motif. The world is pagan. They sleep for a long period of time. They wake up and now the world is no longer pagan. It is a Muslim, or at least predominantly monotheist in that sense. Because I don't know if at that time they were thinking of a division the way that it eventually happens, taking in some of the scholars' works. What are your thoughts on that? Am I on the right track here in saying that really there wasn't this massive break?
Yeah, many religions, it seems to me, have this tendency of thinking of their past as totally different compared to what they bring. So right. They want to sort of highlight the change, the purported change at least. Patricia Crone, in her sort of later studies, she's actually the one who started the study in the Quranic sort of paganism and what the Quranic pagans really were. And of course, there were some scholars before her, and even some classical Muslim scholars pointed this out. But actually, the Quran, if you actually start and work on the basis of the Quran alone and forget the commentary tradition for a little while at least, then it seems that the pagans and the polytheists, mushrikeen, there were commonly translated as polytheists, but what it actually means is something like associators, those who associate other beings to God. So Krone pointed out that actually in a number of verses, the Quran seems to describe these mushrikun as some sort of semi-monotheist. So they subscribe to the belief that Allah is the creator, but they are sort of skeptical of the resurrection and the hereafter. So she sort of problematized these notions that we have on the basis of Islamic era Arabic historiography, which suggests that the Quranic pagans, that is to say, those sort of opponents of the Quranic message that are portrayed in the Quran, that they were in reality like complete polytheists and worship different idols. And this is a narrative that you get from the sort of the Islamic conventional narrative, and which is quite often echoed in modern scholarly literature as well.
That's an interesting observation. As far as definitions go, we need to get off of our chest what you mean by monotheism. What do you mean by paganism? Especially in Arabia from the 300s to 700s, because Christianity, from what I understand, kind of set up this dichotomy between Christian and non-Christian. Before that, you had Jew and Goyim among Jews. And then before that, in Greece, you had, Greeks and barbarians. So you have these categories of groups that tend to differentiate us and then everyone else, or mostly everyone else. And so I'm wondering if you could define monotheism, because people think monotheism always means literally there are no other divinities whatsoever, and there's only one divinity that exists at all, period. And that doesn't seem to be the definition, especially in antiquity.
Yeah, those are very good questions. Thanks. I mean, monotheism, it's a modern concept, right? I think it was coined in the 17th century or thereabouts. Of course, it's a continuum. I mean, there were various ways of subscribing to the belief of the one God, but I think it's still somewhat handy. And many of the, say, late antique writers and ancient writers, for that matter, who we call monotheists, they also seem to quite often underscore the fact that they have this religious system and belief that only has one God and the others have something else, right? So they use it as something to sort of underline their religious identity and importance. So I think it's somewhat handy when we discuss ancient and late ancient evidence. Of course, it's true that, for instance, Christianity and its understanding of Trinity, people have understood and sort of lay Christians have understood in various ways. And also when I was discussing these Quranic pagans and saying that some of them had some sort of idea of monotheism, Patricia Krone has suggested very credibly so that they still believed in some sort of supernatural beings as sort of this angelic intercessors between human being and God. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's a diverse world out there, and it doesn't really, the word monotheism doesn't describe adequately the variety of different beliefs that they were. Pagan. So no one ever called themselves pagan, right? I mean, it's a word that was used by the outsiders, and it's for this period that I'm discussing, so the late ancient Arabia, roughly between 300 and 600 or 700 Common Era. I just mean folks who did not identify as Jewish or Christian. I mean, they might have gone to the local synagogue or the local church, participated in some Jewish or Christian festivities, but they did not formally convert to either of these religions. And this is a phenomenon that is quite well evidenced to the north of Arabian Peninsula in late antiquity. So in various parts of the Eastern Mediterranean or the Near East, we have individuals who, for instance, affiliated to some degree with the local synagogue, and they called themselves God-fearers, and they were called by the Jewish community around them as God-fearers, but they, like I said, they never formally converted to Judaism. And likewise, Christianity also seemed to have gathered these sort of hang-arounds who never formally converted, but sort of adopted a lot of the ideas from the Christians around them.
Interesting. Yeah, that goes back into this period that I focus on mostly, and that is, during that turn of the century, the first century area. And there's a book I was mentioning to you earlier that I'm actually reading, or at least going to read, One God, Pagan Monotheism in the Roman Empire. And this is like idea about God, where these are not Jews. This is before Christianity. These are Greek Romans who have a form of monotheism. And in fact, that's why that loosely needs to be defined, because there are variations of what is meant by that as you defined it. And then, of course, pagan, that no one's calling themselves that, of course. But when I'm looking at from Plato and some of the philosophers on, they are hinting at and really abolition of idols. So this is a very ancient idea of like, even the Persians were like, hey, these are dumb. The statues give no voices, which is one of the hints I wanted to bring up to you. I've got my notes here about this really interesting character early on in Islam, Zayd ibn Nufal. I'm probably butchering his name, who was a monotheist before Muhammad. And tradition, I know that from what I understand, the Sunni tried to suppress this idea that Muhammad himself actually participated in eating unclean food before he realized the truth of monotheism. But this guy was like a monotheist before. And if we grant historicity here and we don't just say it's legend, this guy could have been one of the pivotal men who influenced Muhammad in his journeys, for all we know. I don't know. I'm just speculating here. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah. And I mean, if you look at the Arabic historiographical tradition, the image that you get from there is that there were some Jews and Christians around, especially in Yemen, there were quite a bit of Jews and Christians. The sort of Islamic tradition acknowledges that. But around Mecca and Medina and the Hijaz region, a few individuals are mentioned and named, but not many. And the sort of the overarching picture that you get is that the vast majority of the people were polytheists and worshipped different idols. But the epigraphic evidence that we have from Arabia, and this is sort of an increasing corpus of evidence, clearly shows that monotheism in all of its forms was very much present in Arabia. So the Islamic tradition sort of remembers that, but says that, it was these couple of dudes who had rejected idols and worshipped the one God, and some of them are called Hunafa. So they are sort of pagan monotheists. They are something not related to Judaism or Christianity, but still monotheists. And then there are some mentions of Jews and Christians, especially some individuals mentioned. The most famous Christian individual probably is the cousin of the Prophet's wife, Khadija. Cousin is called Waraka ibn Nawfal. And Waraka, according to the story, when the Prophet Muhammad receives his first revelation, Waraka is one of the people, Khadija being the other, who acknowledge the Prophet Muhammad as a prophet, right? As someone who brings revelation. Now, of course, this sort of narrative and the event can be doubted. It can be critically approached, but I mean, it might be true that there was this person called Waraka ibn Nawfal, and he was Christian. At least the epigraphic record shows that there were a number of people like Waraka ibn Nawfal of the tradition who were Christians, and also other monotheists are there as well.
This shouldn't shock us when the Quran itself engages with Jewish and Christian sacred traditions. So, this shouldn't be, whoa, what? I mean, the text itself is hinting at earlier traditions. And where did those traditions come from? And I know that you have variations of more, I would say, more open-minded, not as traditional, strict fundamentalists who are open to the ideas of, so they're teaching and learning and absorbing ideas from people along the way. And then you have some who you can't really talk, you can't even break the tradition or give like any other alternative position than the one that he got all this insight through revelation in a cave or something. And, you know, it's the same thing with Christianity. It's exactly what I deal with in the same way, where you have very brilliant, open-minded Christian friends of mine. And then you have some that are like, the earth is flat, you know, and it's like, okay, you know, what do you do? You know, what do you do?
Yeah. And I mean, the question of sort of biblical lore and narratives in the Quran, the issue is also connected to the question of, you know, where does the Quranic revelation stem from, right? And there are scholars such as Stephen Shoemaker and earlier John Wansbrough, for instance, who said that, you know, because there's so much Judeo-Christian material in the Quran, and since Arabia did not have any Jews or Christians, then the Quran must be from outside of Arabia, at least from outside Mecca and Medina. Now, when we have this epigraphic evidence, which is growing as we speak, because people are out there collecting evidence on field surveys, and that evidence points toward the notion that there were Jews and Christians in various parts of the peninsula. So that makes, for me at least, it more credible, sort of the conventional narrative that, you know, the Quran represents the message of, you know, the Prophet Muhammad, and it was quite soon collected and canonized and standardized and all that. Of course, it's a very debated issue, but at least the epigraphic evidence does not make it impossible that the Quran stems from, you know, Mecca and Medina, that region. In fact, it seems to sort of supports the conventional narrative. But then when it comes to the Islamic tradition's portrayal of the religious phenomena of Arabia before Islam, there I think we should approach the tradition with a lot of, you know, criticism, be very doubtful of what we read. Of course, I think there's quite a bit there in Arabic historiography, which is credible, or somewhat credible at least, but much of it is, you know, later lore that has been developed precisely to emphasize the difference between Islam and what was before it.
When I look at, we're going way back, when I look at Hesiod, you know, Homer and Hesiod, and I'm reading about Greek flood myth of Deucalion, there's no floods, you know, in the region where Greece is located that are prevalent enough for them to have this kind of myth. So academics say the Eastern myths, Mesopotamia, Utnapishtim, maybe even biblical Noah, these kinds of myths that are floating around about floods were traveled to these regions. And I've heard some people who are being critical try to say, well, when we have Gog and Magog, this region in the north of Mesopotamia that are found in the Quran, they will argue that, oh, this is pointing toward the evidence that the Quran must have come from north, way outside of this area up there. And I thought to myself, I mean, is it possible? Yeah. But like, that's assuming that stories and locations don't travel and don't carry meaning in different areas. And then I thought about it. If Muhammad was a merchant, just say, he's traveling, he's learning, he's seeing things from up north when he travels, and then he's bringing stories with him that have significant impact on the ideology of people during that day. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think correct in assuming this idea of the apocalypse, the Gog, Magog, final end times idea from the north just made its way down somehow, rather than assuming that this proves the Quran must have come from that area?
No, I think it's completely possible. I mean, various sorts of narratives were very freely, traveling also in Arabia. I mean, quite often people think that Arabia is somehow disconnected from the wider world, but it's actually like really, I mean, they are so important regions. I mean, Syria, Iraq, to the north, Iran, and then to the south, we have in the southern Arabia, we have Yemen, and on the other side of the Red Sea, we have Ethiopia, an important Christian country since the 4th century. So there were various places where these narratives could have come from. That's definitely possible. And, various scholars such as Suleiman Dost has pointed out that actually the Ethiopic literature is very much in the background of some Quranic narratives. And then on the other hand, in some other Quranic narratives, we have the Syriac text, the Syriac Christian text. So, it seems that I mean, there were so many different paths of transmission of these stories that, even the Gog Magog story could have easily traveled there.
That's right.
And I mean, there were no borders for the most part in the say 6th century Arabia or 5th century Arabia. I mean, it was much easier to travel back then than it's today, because you have national states, you need to have visas and passports and all that in place. Of course, back then you would have to travel by camel, but nobody was asking for your passport or anything like that. You could just go there. And, even in the epigraphic evidence, we have indications of people traveling. So we have a Nabatean inscription. This is probably from the 2nd or 3rd century, paleographically dating. And the inscription mentions that, the guy was from Yathrib, Medina, being the later name of Yathrib. And the inscription was found, if I remember correctly, some 500 kilometers to the north. So that's 300 miles. And that's just one indication that people were traveling, quite freely. And if the Prophet Muhammad was a merchant, which is something that we find in a number of non-Arabic texts in particular, and some Arabic texts as well, then of course, it's possible that he was traveling as well to Syria and otherwise. But even if he didn't go himself, I mean, these narratives were probably very well known in Arabian Peninsula even before his time.
Wow. Okay, so let's look at this map real quick, just so everybody's on the same page. I'm really interested in kind of highlighting some of these. You have your kind of code is on the right here. You got the cross. Everyone knows is a Christian symbol. So Christian inscriptions on the map you can see here with the crosses. You also have Jewish inscriptions, and you can see where the Jewish inscriptions are with the Star of David. And then you also have the unclassified monotheist inscriptions. And if you notice in the bottom in the red, you say late ancient Yemen has bequeathed over 150 inscriptions in all categories. So, unlisted or unclassified, Christian and Jewish, written in Sabbaic and Paleo-Arabic. So I wanted to ask you something before we move into this kind of histories of religion, the evolution or even the passing down of traditions, I would say, from the ancient Near East going way back. And I want to dig into your thoughts. You might have to speculate a little, but I hope that's okay with you. I know scholars don't like doing that too much because they want to be precise, but it's a little fun. The question I have, as Muhammad in his context, him and his followers in his context, what category would you say best fits this prophet, this figure? Is there any reason to think we should lean into the unclassified area in putting the rise and life of Muhammad and saying he's drawing from the other two, but he's clearly breaking away as well, so therefore we should put him in the unclassified category out the gate? Or is there reason to think Jewish more, Christian more, or what do you think in all the research you've ever done?
Yeah, I would say definitely unclassified. So we don't even have to hypothesize about this, because the Quran is quite clear in identifying or characterizing the Prophet Muhammad as a Nabi al-Ummi. And the word Ummi in the tradition is translated as illiterate. A Nabi means a prophet, or the prophet in this case. But the word Ummi probably means someone from Gentile or pagan background. So it's, similar word to the Greek ethnikos, someone coming from an ethnos. So it can mean somebody coming from an ethnic group or nation, but also in particular a pagan, somebody from a pagan background. And it seems that the Quran quite clearly identifies the Prophet Muhammad as somebody who is coming from this sort of background, not Jewish or Christian, but somebody else, prophet from the pagan background. And
it's the lore too, right? The later lore of his father with the arrows and the kind of superstitions that they had about sacrificing, all these things that seem to come outside of a Christian or Jewish background. I'm not saying that those are history, but I'm saying they may at least give, while the story might be legend or whatnot, there's kind of a hint at saying, as early on as our traditions go, his background, his ancestors are also known outside of this Christian and Jewish context.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, I mean, like I mentioned, there seems to be in the family of Khadija, there are actually a number of Christian individuals that are mentioned in Arabic sources. Waraqa ibn Nawfal is just one of them. So there are some others as well who are mentioned as having converted to Christianity. So definitely take that into account. The sort of Christianity in particular seems to have been very much in the family of the Prophet Muhammad, in the extended family at least of the Prophet Muhammad, albeit he came from sort of like a non-Jewish, non-Christian background. Then, of course, you have also, especially in the Medinan period, you have a lot of and various contacts with different Jewish individuals and groups, and you have the Prophet Muhammad also marrying a number of Jewish women.
There's a lot there. Okay, let's go into the histories of religion section a little bit on the ideas of gods. I'm doing a documentary right now on the origin of Yahweh and diving into what a fascinating journey. To give a little context, just to kind of as we lead into where I'm trying to go with this discussion, if possible, is Yahweh comes almost out of nowhere. He's not in the Canaanite inscriptions. We don't have him in the list at Ugarit with the rest of the pantheon with El and Baal and Asherah and Mat, and the names go on and on, Chemosh, all these different deities. And then all of a sudden, 8th, 9th century BCE, we find this introduced deity named Yahweh, who ends up over time, slowly, you can even see it in the Bible, where he's not the supreme. He's one of the sons. He gets incorporated and then eventually gets merged into El. And I went back to the ancient Mesopotamian Ilu, I-L-U, or Il, I-L, which is the predecessor name in Mesopotamia for El in Ugarit, and then the Hittites. And you start to kind of see these patterns and an evolution of that god. And then I was looking, as we were diving into pre-monotheistic, pre-Islamic monotheism in this area, and there's a lot of these mentions of the god Allat, this female goddess, and there's a wonderful, wonderful image. I even enhanced the quality so people could actually see it. This is the image here that actually has a lot of, I would almost say, Greek, Roman artistic. You have Medusa on the chest of her. She's holding a spear. She's wearing almost like a Phrygian type cap in a way. And there's all sorts of elements, but there's 3 goddesses. These goddesses play a significant role in, I think there's a mention of them in the Quran. Correct me if I'm wrong, but then there's further elaboration of condemnation of these gods in the Islamic tradition. And I was trying to find out, where does this god Allat come from? And being, I'm not a philologist, I don't know linguistics on that level, and I have no way of knowing, in my mind, in an English world, Allah and Allat sound, that means nothing when you actually study the languages. But I found an ancient or a writing from Herodotus in the 5th century who is mentioning the goddess, but he calls her, the specific name is Ililat, A-L-I-L-A-T. He equates her with Aphrodite. Now, this might have been a common thing for the Hellenists or even Greeks to do, to find commonality with their deities and these other regional cults. But I'm wondering about the evolution, and I'm also wondering about Allah's evolution and where that comes from. Is that coming from El? I had an interesting discussion with our friend Al-Jalad, and he goes in and says, like, these inscriptions that are a little north of where we're talking, they're mentioning these gods and goddesses and kind of a paganism. But I wondered if this stuff has connection to this long tradition of ancient Near Eastern deities. Where did these gods come from? What are your thoughts? Sorry, big question.
Wow, that's a great question, Derek. I mean, these deities, Allat and Al-Uzza in particular, 2 female deities, very well known in very early pre-Islamic epigraphic evidence, the ancient one in particular. They are very well known there, and definitely something that people worshipped in up to the maybe 3rd century Common Era. And these sort of identifications of Allat, for instance, or Al-Uzza with specific Greek deities, that seems to have happened in some instances, in particular in places where sort of Hellenistic civilization was very, flourishing in sort of Syria-Palestine region, and by some Greek authors as well who wanted to do that sort of identification. But the names themselves Allah being sort of like a feminine form of Allah, and Al-Uzza meaning, somebody who is a great one. Those are, they are Arabic names, and they are not, evidenced anywhere else except in various Arabic inscriptions, including the Safavidic corpus, which is sort of like very old Arabic inscriptions in that corpus. So, up to the 4th century, many of these deities and Allah and Al-Uzza and also Manat are mentioned in the Quran as well. And, it is said that they are mere names, and, your fathers worship them. And people have speculated then on the basis of this Quran passage and the Islamic tradition, to what extent these, we might call them pagan deities, were still worshipped on the eve of Islam. And it seems that there's some evidence of Al-Uzza in particular, the cult of Al-Uzza continuing up to the life of the Prophet Muhammad in some parts of the peninsula, for instance. But the other deities seem to have sort of disappeared already. And when we see in the epigraphic evidence between 400 and 600 Common Era any sort of religious, content is monotheistic, and the god is always a male god, and he is called with the name Allah or Al-Ilah or Ar-Rab, meaning the Lord. And what's the etymology of Allah? It seems that, the name comes from Al-Ilah, which means the God. So that's sort of like a, shortened form of Al-Ilah.
Interesting. And what's the oldest evidence we have of the name of Allah in some form that we could identify it as that God in history? And in that question, I kind of am asking because as Yahweh evolves to take over the pantheon, is there a pre-monotheistic context in which this God is identified?
Yeah, there certainly is, as in particular in the Safavidic inscriptions. So Safavidic inscriptions, they mostly come from modern-day Jordan, also some from Saudi Arabia, Syria, that sort of region. And they number over 40,000, so it's a vast corpus. It's like really, really huge. And there's still thousands to be discovered. And so this corpus dates from, at least the scholars believe that it dates, we don't have any sort of really good evidence for this. It dates from around 400 BCE to 400 CE or 300 CE. That's sort of the range that, the scholars work with. And there, in some Safavidic inscriptions, Allah is rare in those inscriptions. Allah occurs often. And some other deities. Dushara, a Nabatean deity, is very popular in Safavidic inscriptions as well. But Allah occurs sometimes, and sometimes he indeed occurs in connection with other gods. So there, in this corpus, he is definitely not the only god. He is one of the gods. Of course, some have speculated that also back then, people thought that Allah is sort of like a high god who is somewhat more distant than the other lesser deities such as Allah and Al-Uzza on the basis of this reasoning. But there's no pantheon mentioned in the Safavidic inscriptions. And if we just go by numbers and sort of the numbers of occurrences of these different deities, it seems to me that Allah is the high god, than definitely higher goddess than Allah.
Right. So technically, to make that easier to understand for people is that because it doesn't clearly define a pantheon and tell us who's the high, who's not the highest, based upon how often they are invoked, how often they are mentioned. If we use that reasoning, since we don't have evidence of them saying this god is at the top and this god is beneath, and you know what I mean, then we would go with whoever's mentioned the most seems to be the most, at least we can't prove this, but like they're more important for the average person writing these inscriptions. And I find this interesting because El in Ugaritic is the chief deity. But when you go back to Il, which is the same deity in Mesopotamia, the chief deity is Anu. It's a different god. And so it's to me, I love learning how these gods go from lesser deities and then take over in the human, almost want to say like anthropology kind of take, watching them grow and become what they are. And this is a wonderful topic.
Yeah, of course, I suppose the evolution of Allah to become the highest God and the only God by the 5th and 6th centuries is a little bit different from the ancient Jewish history, because back then you did not have, at least we don't have much evidence of people having very strong sort of monotheistic views. So this sort of evolution of one of the gods becoming the highest God and then the sole God is something unique. It's
Right.
new in world history. But then if we think about Arabian Peninsula between 400 and 600, I mean, Judaism and Christianity were already there. Also Zoroastrianism, we can debate if it's a monotheist religion, but in the texts that survive, quite often it's portrayed as, somewhat monotheist at least. So you already have Judaism and Christianity around, and it is in the context of these religions that Allah becomes the supreme deity and then the only God.
This, I don't know if you've heard of this before, but I'm reading that book, One God in Pagan Context in the Roman Empire. This really blew my mind. And it works in this documentary I'm doing on Yahweh, but the Bacchic cult of Dionysus was made illegal by the Roman Empire because it was so disruptive in the social construct of the society in causing people who are participants of the cult to forsake all deities and only worship Dionysus. Right. And there are lots of evidence of this where Dionysus is exclusively worshipped. And then if you go to Herodotus and you read book 4, paragraph 94, I have it memorized because I've quoted all the time when I talk about Christianity and resurrection and promise of eternal life. There's this figure named Zalmoxis. Zalmoxis is another inspired by Dionysian attributes. He's a figure whom the believers of this cult say that when one dies, they don't die. They really just go to Zalmoxis. So they're not really dead. It indicates that they will live forever, that they only worship Zalmoxis, like he's the only God. And this is a pagan context. And so I'm saying it seems that we have this notion, monotheism only comes from Abrahamic faiths. That is not correct. We're having to rethink how the philosophies and the cults weren't just through Abrahamic faiths that believed in a one God. And it just blew my mind to think about this.
Yeah.
How much more is there that we don't recognize because of the old, outdated ideas that we get in the habit of?
Right. And if we compare that situation to sort of Arabia on the eve of Islam and, especially look at these unclassified monotheist inscriptions, maybe with the passing of time, where more evidence comes to light, we start to understand who these people really were. So my supposition at the moment is that many of them actually were Jews and Christians. They just don't, mention it in the inscription. I would say that perhaps the majority of them were Christians, and that's my, at least hypothesis at the moment. But it's probable that there's sort of a diverse group of people producing these inscriptions, which, they invoke the one God and him only, but they don't really mention any specific practices, religious practices, or any other beliefs that this person might have held. So it's really difficult to know at the moment what the sort of the exact religious map was, but we at least start to, with the epigraphic evidence at hand, we start to understand some of the phenomena that were going on in Arabia.
I was reading Wikipedia, this is in the vein of the Alat. Sorry, I'm kind of shifting just back into this Alat thing for 1 second, because in Wikipedia, and I'm reading it right now, Alat, also spelled Alat, Alatu, Ilalat, is a pre-Islamic Arabian goddess, at one time worshipped under various associations throughout the entire Arabian Peninsula, including Mecca, where she was worshipped along Al-Uzza, which you mentioned, and Manat as one of the daughters of Allah. Well, usually when I'm looking on Wikipedia, I usually love seeing I like to go to the footnote and see who the academic, where the publication. I like to travel and follow the evidence. The interesting thing about this, and you just type in AL-LAT for anyone who's online who might want to look this up. The footnotes don't appear. 1 and 2 do not appear in the first paragraph. The first footnote is 3. And I was wondering, as an expert, do you know where the idea that Allah is a daughter of Allah
comes
from? Is there an inscription somewhere that kind of indicates this?
I mean, it comes from the Quran quite clearly. So the Quran says that, and this is one of the rare instances where any pagan deities are actually mentioned. So it says that, I mean, Allah, Al-Uzza, and Manat that people claimed that they were daughters of God, whereas actually they are mere names and something that your fathers worship, but they are nothing. So that's the sort of probably the source of this information. Now the question arises, of course, is this something that people actually believed, or is that something that the Quran only claims that people believed? And we don't have any evidence for that, I believe, of any epigraphic evidence at least, that would state that this sort of pantheon of Father God and then these three daughters would have existed. Of course, it's possible, but one would need to prove that with some solid text that comes from.
For the first time ever, I started reading. I know it's outdated, but I still enjoyed what I heard in terms of learning. Sir James George Fraser. And he brings up magic. Of course, I know he has some of his model isn't most accurate in terms of each specific cult, but he brings up this idea of magic, and then religion comes in, and they're still carrying over this idea of magic. And he gave this funny example where Christian churches, and I can't remember the area, when it wouldn't rain, they would bring out the statue. Let's just pretend the statue Saint Joseph.
Right.
And they put Saint Joseph out there, and they'd ask the saint, please help us get rain. Rain doesn't show up. So now they're getting hey, we have to have crops. So now they put him in timeout and they turn him toward the wall, and they make him hey, you have to face the wall now. And then the crops, it's still not raining. So now they're you know what? I'm going to put the statue out there where the dry crops are and let him experience the heat of the sun. Now, it just made me think from my last interview with Al-Jalad, and we talked deep about this. He said he talked to one of the locals. They're clearly Muslim. They're clearly in an Islamic context, and they're not pagan. But their ancestors in their not too distant past would take a wooden statue of a female, maybe even a goddess. So it's a local folklore, and run her through the valley or put them out there to try and make rain come. And this makes me wonder if the Quran might be hinting at a local thing that may not even have left any epigraphic evidence, but it's just a custom that some may have said. I mean, total speculation. We can't know without proof. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, the world of religions and religious beliefs is vast. And I mean, people, especially common people outside the sort of religious scholarly class, people have beliefs that are not always, they do not follow the orthodoxy, however that is defined. So that's very common, I would say. And that probably is true for pre-Islamic times and also Islamic times. And of course, we have a lot of evidence from various Muslim communities today, for instance, that these sort of, which we might call magical practices, sometimes practiced. I mean, the, stuff having to do with the evil eye, for instance, is something that is very, very real to a lot of people. And of course, there's a lot of variation in that. So some people think that that's completely un-Islamic and anti-Islamic to really believe in that sort of stuff, but to a lot of Muslims that's important, and Christians too. There's this, for instance, in Finland and in the States, there have been various polls that have been conducted among just regular Christians. You phone them and ask about their beliefs, and from Finland, for instance, there was very few who said that they believe in the God as the church teaches them, but many people still believed in some higher power, and many people say that is God, but they just, there's so many variety of different religious beliefs and practices that so-called normal people have.
I don't want to leave anything hanging in terms of something you might want to say. One thought that did come to mind, and I brought this to our friend Marijn, and I said, look, what are the odds that the polytheist are Christian in some sense? Because the Christians have a Trinity, and clearly it's not a Trinity position in the Quran. And the way they describe the Trinity, depending on how you answer it, and there are different ways scholars answer this, with Mary involved, which is odd. It may not be so odd to people at the time in the region, who knows? But I'm thinking about it going, I know when I was a Protestant Christian, I thought that Roman Catholicism was paganism. And I was like, this is pagan. They are worshiping Mary. They are worshiping statues. They are polytheist. That is exactly what these guys are. And so I wonder if that's anachronistic of me to assume that this is what they may have thought. But what are your thoughts about the idea that some of these pagans are actually Christians by Muhammad?
Yeah, I mean, the Quran describes the mushrikun, usually translated as polytheists, but meaning something like associators, as, people who might be semi-monotheists, but don't get the whole idea and are not strict monotheists. And, some of them might be skeptical of the afterlife. This would probably not include so many Christians, this group of people. But then there are some passages which actually ascribe shirk, or this sort of notion of associating other gods or other beings to God, to also Christians and Jews as well. So clearly in the Quran's view, at least some of the Christians can be also considered mushrikun, but not definitely all of them. And there's actually quite a bit of Quranic material that very positively describes the Christians and says that they are actually the believers or part of the believers.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't it Dr. Donner's position that earlier passages of the Quran indicate a unity amongst the communities, and then later you get indications of a break?
Yeah, I mean...
What's your position?
Yeah, I would say that most scholars say that in the Meccan period there's some sort of unity, but then during the Medinan period there's a breaking of paths. What Fred Donner has suggested is that this era of sort of Islamic identity formation takes quite much longer, up to the year 700 or thereabouts. So Prophet Muhammad dies in 632. But then even after his death, there's this period where, Islam did not really have a name. Al-Islam, the word that later comes to mean Islam with a capital letter, only means obedience to God. So it's a general marker that, according to the Quran, many different monotheists have. So Fred Donner says that it actually, even during the Medinan period and quite much later, this sort of identity was evolving. And I believe in that. I, in the book, argue for that with some new evidence as well. And so to begin with the idea of social categories, so we don't have this social category of Muslims evidenced in, I would say, any at least dated documentary evidence before the year 700 or thereabouts. So it's only by then that we start to see that social category. And there's some, like I mentioned, also in the Quran, but some other post-Quranic evidence as well to suggest that there were actually Jews and Christians joining the movement without probably sort of rejecting their old identity as Jews and Christians. So they did not thought of themselves as converting to some new religion, it would seem to me. So, and I think, if you think about the history of early Christianity, that sort of is very illuminating in this respect. So we have what is called by many scholars Jesus movement or Christ believers, who did not call themselves Christians until the early 2nd century Common Era. So we have a movement of Jews and Gentiles who, deemed Jesus Christ, but they did not thought of themselves necessarily as totally different from other varieties of Judaism, and they lacked a name and that sort of thing. And in the early movement of followers of the Prophet Muhammad, I think we have something similar. So we have a group that follows a prophet, an eschatological prophet, and this group includes pagans, Jews, and Christians who, at least not in all cases, did not think of themselves as leaving their old faith and, becoming part of something completely new. So, if you think about the early Jesus movement, and not only Jesus himself, but like Paul and other important figures in the movement, I mean, they were still clearly Jews, even though they were Christ believers, but they were still clearly Jews. So something similar, I would suggest, was happening during the Prophet Muhammad's life, and then also in the century that followed it.
That is an amazing observation to consider, what you just said. even with Judaism, before Christianity, like the rise and origins of Judaism as a religion, if you will, identifying itself as this. Jonathan Adler, other archaeologists have pointed out the epigraphic archaeological evidence suggests that Judaism, the practice of Torah law, was not practiced by the common folks any time before the 3rd century BCE.
Right.
And during this time, we get the rise of Dead Sea Scroll material with different sects of Jews competing for what the texts are, what the proper following of what laws, what the truth is. And so it's like they're grinding it out and then parting of ways of different ideas of different Judaisms. The same thing with Christianity, as you said. Many scholars even go as far as saying that these Gentiles aren't converting. That's anachronistic to say that. They're just turning from idols.
Right.
They're not even like converting. They're just kind of turning from these ways. And it's not like they became a different thing. They're still called Gentiles. Paul still uses the term ethne for them.
Right.
They don't become something different. They may have the pneuma, which is philosophy, the Middle Platonist idea of philosophy. Then, of course, you bring up Islam. I'm thinking of like more recent history of Mormonism. Seeing Joseph Smith, clever guy when you read about him. He took already existing even pastors of churches that were already teaching a Trinity. They had all these ideas, and he convinces them to join this kind of program of Jesus Christ and Christianity. And they did not, what we think of as Mormon doctrine, that was not something that they accepted, but maybe over time some were persuaded to it. But like, it was more about like, how do we get this thing off the ground? How do we survive as a group? Then once they gain power, then you could start to change. And then the splitting of different versions. And I imagine that happens in early Islam. It's not just one version of Islam. We already have breaks right out the gate, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, what's common to many of these movements that we'll be discussing is that they're eschatological movements. And Jesus as well is considered by many people who work on the history of Jesus as a sort of like an eschatological prophet. And so is the Prophet Muhammad. So this idea that the end is nigh is very, very important to many of these messages that these people bring or convey. So, and that probably also affects the situation of different group identities. So it seems that in the early history of many of these groups, they are quite open to, various people to come in and not necessarily go through any conversion ritual or practice. And in the case of early Islam, we don't have any evidence of any sort of like conversion. Nowadays you take the Shahada, the testimony of faith, and by doing that you convert. But in early Islamic times, we don't have at least any evidence that that's something that people had to do to join the group. So, and we actually have, I would say, explicit evidence that there were some Jews and Christians in the movement, inside the movement. And of course, according to the Islamic tradition, some of these, or many of these figures are portrayed as converting to Islam. But then there are also other narratives that, do not mention any conversion. There's this great fighter and rabbi, a Medinan figure called Mukhayriq, who dies in one of the battles fighting with the early Muslim community. And, Prophet Muhammad prays for him after his demise, and it says that he, according to the story at least, that Mukhayriq was the best of the Jews. And in many of these narratives, for instance, you don't have any mention of this guy converting to any new religion. And especially if you go by more contemporary stuff, so the Quran and the so-called Constitution of Medina, which is, considered by many scholars to be a contemporary document, even though it's transmitted in much later sources. So in these more contemporary sources, you definitely have, I would say, quite clear indication of some Jews and Christians being accepted as the members of and there's no requirement for them to convert into anything. Of course, I would suppose that the new movement, required some sort of adapting to the various beliefs. So if you were very much into Trinity before, probably you would not be so welcome to say that in the crowd of the followers of Muhammad, because the Quranic message contains that very clear idea of very strict monotheism and, the rejection of sonship of Jesus and all the rest. So that was definitely happening. But, by and large, I don't think people thought of them converting to something new. Of course, they believed in a new prophet that came and brought a new revelation that was, of course, a growing corpus of revelation. And, it's difficult to say what importance it held back in the day. I mean, when the Prophet Muhammad was still alive, was it something that was commonly repeated to the believers? And did all the believers attend these sessions if it did? People knew some parts of the Quran, but not the whole text. And of course, it was still growing up to the death of the Prophet Muhammad.
You mentioned apocalypticism, and that's a whole you could probably go on forever. But just to get your thoughts on that, I am persuaded, looking at the New Testament, the Apostle Paul was convinced. He thought it was going to happen in his life. Many of the New Testament texts in the Gospels indicate an apocalyptic thought. Someone thought it, whether it was the authors or it hints at an earlier kernel that Jesus himself was apocalyptic. John the Baptist was clearly apocalyptic according to the portrayal. Jewish, do I need to explain how apocalyptic there were Jewish thoughts? 4th Baruch, 2nd Ezra, the book of Revelation. So I've heard the comment that Muhammad himself, the Prophet Muhammad, was apocalyptic. Did that shift? What are your personal thoughts on that? Do you think that he was more in Mecca, very apocalyptic, and then when he had power in Medina, it was a little less so? Or do you think it was consistent in his life that he thought that maybe the end would happen sometime in his life?
If you go by the Quran, it would seem that there's some sort of change, but it doesn't seem that it was completely, abandoned during the Medinan period either. It's very strong in Meccan period, that's for sure. And it's this sort of eschatological urgency is very much present there. But even in Medinan passages, you have, some verses that say that the end is coming, some that say that, okay, maybe it has already come. That's sort of similar that you have with Jesus's message that, already there, but not quite yet, as some scholars have characterized it. So, but it definitely is true that during the Medinan period, it becomes a lesser theme. It's not so important anymore. Of course, at the time in Medina, the Prophet Muhammad was running a state, even though it would seem that there were still, of course, other Medinan figures that held some power, were important figures in their tribes, but still it seems that Muhammad was considered by many, if not all, Medinans as their leader. And in the Medinan period, you have some legislation that comes, some new theological developments that come in the Medinan periods. And the sort of the eschatological urgency is to some degree abandoned, but not eschatology as theme. That's definitely still happening, but is it happening now? There's less certainty in the Medinan Quran than in the Meccan. I think in the epistles of Apostle Paul, people have also identified a similar sort of development there. And there's this great quotation.
He hasn't let it go. He never lets it go, but there are scholars who wonder if by the later letters, if he's starting to second guess or question if it's going to happen while he's alive or right after he's dead, because he thinks he's part of it, though. He thinks in earlier letters, it's happening in his life. He's going to be alive and it's going to happen. And then later, especially in his Philippian letter, he's imprisoned and he starts to wonder, they might kill me. And if I die, then it's going to happen probably very soon after I die. That seems to be what the academics I've been talking to say. And it makes me wonder, with the work of Jonathan Z. Smith and other academics who they're experts on apocalypticism, usually these ideas of eschatology with the end near, the destruction of evil, the vindication of the righteous and good coming for those who are weak. If I think of Mecca and I use a psychology, kind of apocalyptic psychology to him, he's saying that he's persecuted. He doesn't have power, so he can't control what's happening. And therefore, a lot of Jews in this circumstance have a belief. Look at the Qumran sect in Dead Sea. They believe God's going to do the work because they don't have the power, but God has the power, and that he's going to come in and he's going to vindicate them. He's going to reward them and destroy the wicked. If we take that, I know you can't truly psychoanalyze people in the past, but if we take that and apply it to them under persecution, then it would have been even maybe more strong of the expectation that God's going to help his righteous people, which is us. Then he gets in Medina, he gets a little power. He's not under the persecution like he was. You could expect it to minimize, but not go away completely necessarily.
Right. And I have this hypothesis that I want to explore in some article about sort of what aroused the opposition to the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca. If we believe, of course, and in the Quran as well, you can see that there's opposition to him, and and also you can somewhat in the sort of later Meccan surahs see that the mood in the community is getting more pessimistic, and then at some point he has to live with his community. And of course you have that very much present in the Islamic tradition, that he's persecuted and all that. But if we take into account the epigraphic evidence that suggests that the idea of monotheism was already well established in all parts of the Arabian Peninsula, we might say. There's also some epigraphic evidence from between Taif and Mecca, so two nearby towns. This evidence has been published by Ahmad al-Jalad and Haitham Sidki in recent years. And so these three inscriptions, probably all pre-Islamic, maybe two of them actually contemporary to the Prophet Muhammad, all monotheist. So was the message of monotheism that the Meccan Quran is clearly preaching and conveying, was that enough to trigger people to be very opposed to him and drive him away? I'm not completely sure. If we accept, and of course this can be debated and new evidence can change all this reconstruction, if we accept that monotheism was very well established, it was common and everyday in Mecca also for people to have this sort of beliefs. So if there's a monotheist prophet preaching that you should believe in one God and him only, I'm not sure if that alone is something that would have triggered the opposition to the prophet. Maybe, in fact, the eschatological aspect in his Meccan preaching, Quranic surahs, was something that triggered a lot of people to be opposed to him. Like we discussed, and Patricia Krone has suggested this on the basis of the Quran, and Nikolai Sinai has studied pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. Maybe among these pagan monotheists, there were people who, while being monotheists, were rather skeptical of the idea of the afterlife and the end and the hereafter. So maybe it's this part of the sort of Meccan Quranic message that triggered the opposition to the Prophet Muhammad. I don't know. That's a hypothesis.
I love this. I'm so glad. In fact, I feel like I almost thought, okay, we're getting near our end in this discussion, and I don't want to make you stick around if there isn't something interesting. And now you made it even more interesting, because let's help our viewer in case they aren't tracking along, because a lot of people will probably be able to track what's happening. But just to give context, the understood narrative that we are given, that seems to be the most common, is that Muhammad he's preaching, just like Paul, in a way, in a polytheistic society to people who have all these other gods about the one true God. That doesn't mean he isn't bumping shoulders with Christians and Jews, but the society at large seems to be in the portrayal as these polytheists. They have many gods. The Kaaba has so many gods and statues and idols, and there's all these gods everywhere, and there's paganism everywhere. And it's just so, but if we grant the epigraphic evidence, like you're saying, and that the societies aren't as polytheistic as we suppose, then how do we explain the data now? What is the real beef? What is the real problem? It isn't you're telling me to stop worship these many gods. If it is really monotheistic in Mecca and Medina, and well, mainly Mecca in this case, then what's the problem? You're saying, could it be that he is believing in an afterlife and that many people don't believe in an afterlife? Could it be that he's apocalyptic, that the end is about to happen right now and they're going, stop, we don't want to hear all that? What evidence do we have that can maybe give us a good hypothesis on why he's persecuted? And then here's the other question. I don't doubt that he probably was, but is there reason to doubt that he was ever persecuted in Mecca? I mean, now we're getting really critical, but like, just to throw out ideas since we're hypothesizing, what are your thoughts about that idea?
I mean, that's very credible, good hypothesis, definitely. And I mean, there's this great recent article by Peter Webb. It's called something like the Pre-Islamic Hajj or pilgrimage to Mecca or something like along those lines. It came out last year. And he describes and discusses the pre-Islamic poetical evidence that we have of Mecca and the pilgrimage to that place, right? And the rituals associated with that place. And he accepts, I think, like 4 or 5 of the occurrences in this corpus as authentic, and the whole question of the poetical corpus and its authenticity is very much debated. But I mean, he reads the sources very critically and rejects some of the occurrences of the term of the notion of the pilgrimage to Mecca. And some, and I think, the article is very credible and the argument as well. If we accept those 4 or 5 instances of, references to the pilgrimage to Mecca as authentic, then it would seem that also the Kaaba shrine and the pilgrimage was also associated with the one God already, because all of those, 4 or 5 poetical excerpts that he defines as authentic describe Al-Ilah or Allah, the one God, as being the sort of the protector of that, practice and that place. And there's no mention of any other God or any idol. And of course, according to the narrative, the sort of the conventional narrative that you get from various biographies of the Prophet and other Arabic literary evidence is that there were 360 idols around the Kaaba shrine. And according to that view, then sort of the main thrust and goal of the Prophet Muhammad's mission was to, cleanse the Kaaba shrine of those idols. But if there were none when the Prophet Muhammad was living, and if there was nothing to be cleansed because, the pilgrimage was already being understood as being done as worship to the one God, then, you have to read a lot of the traditional narrative. And I think the idea of the eschatological urgency is something that we have to take into account, which is very much present in the Meccan Quran. You cannot deny it. In fact, a lot of the medieval Muslim commentators of the Quran and theologians accepted that this is the fact, that the Meccan Quran included, especially the Meccan Quran, but also the Medinan surahs of the Quran, include that eschatological urgency, and they offered various theological interpretations for that. So some suggested, for instance, that of course the Prophet Muhammad knew that the end will not happen during his lifetime, but he was just saying that in order to get people to believe, and they did. So some medieval Muslim theologians actually, put forward such an interpretation, and there are others that they also offer. So I think the eschatological urgency was something that possibly triggered a lot of opposition.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Also, perhaps on part of some Jews and Christians, even though they believed in the end and the afterlife. I mean, some of them might have been also sort of critical, like, now? Is it happening now? Really? Like, who is this person to say like that is happening now? So this might also have been the case in the context of some Jews and Christians as well in Mecca.
In factoring in a patriarchal society, just common sense should tell you the struggle over power and personality may be a factor, especially when someone's claiming they have this divine pedigree. You're going to create problems. In fact, if we looked at the life of Joseph Smith, for example, just to give another kind of human example, he had other problems too that factored in, but like there's a power struggle and constant personality struggle. He was very charismatic with his words and was persuasive, but there were other men who also had power. And you're dealing with a society where, there's a struggle for leadership. And the fact that he ends up in Medina getting power maybe he's trying to go for power here. I mean, this is all speculation, but maybe he's trying to get power in Mecca based on his teachings, and they're like, get out of here. We already have power. We already have who we want, where we want, and the powers that be were not interested, and they were trying to get him out. And sure enough, they won by getting him out, but he gathers a larger following and more power over here, which that's my opinion. If you look at it, he's aiming for the power and he gets it
Yeah, that's a possible interpretation. I suppose the problem with that is if you go by the Quran, is that you don't see so much of that sort of political discourse at all in the Meccan period. I mean, on top of my head, I don't remember seeing much in the Meccan surahs of the Quran which would hint at the Prophet Muhammad trying to get political power, being sort of that motivated to us that I don't know. I just don't read it there. Of course, it doesn't mean that it didn't
right. We don't know everything he did every day, and it's not documented. Like on Wednesday he did this, and on Thursday. But I like your pushback. When we look at some of the passages, is it in Meccan Quranic passages where there are people accusing him of learning from Jews and Christians at night to teach his teachings? So he's going and learning. Is that in the earlier material when they're accusing him of like getting his ideas from Christians and Jews?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it is from a Meccan.
Part of me just wonders, here's this guy telling us what the message is. Again, even if it's not political, there's this power struggle, even in a cult setting, where he is the teacher. And a lot of these stories later, we would say are probably in the legend or folktale or something, where here is this monk who sees him at the tree and knows that he's the one. And then here is this rabbi who sees him and he's like, you're the one. So like, even if it wasn't political in Mecca, could we at least say that it's cultically political? Like he is establishing himself as the true teacher of righteousness, the true teacher of the true faith. And it's starting to be a power struggle there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, even if you think about the relationship between or to the Jews and Christians, possibly in Mecca, of course, we don't have much evidence of them, but there are various Quranic passages that seem to indicate that there were definitely Jews and Christians around. And all of those references to the Banu Israel or the Israelites, and also those given the book, so those that have been given the scripture before, the word per Ahlul Kitab or the people of the scripture does not really appear in the Meccan period, nor does Yahud or Nasara, Jews and Christians. But they're called Israelites and people that have been given the scripture before, or some other sort of characterization of Jews and Christians. And all of them are positive in the Meccan Quran. But of course, that does seems to be very welcoming to various Jews and Christians to become part of the movement. But of course, that doesn't mean that a new sort of revelation that starts to come to a new prophet would not trigger a lot of opposition among Jews and Christians, even if that revelation contains positive descriptions of Jews and Christians.
Right.
So, that's
right. Look at the New Testament. Just kind of, I mean, because that's what I know so well. Paul in his letters, Acts is a little bit fictional in my opinion. So I like to go to Paul's letters. That doesn't mean it wasn't added at some point, but Paul indicates he went to synagogues and he gets whipped by other Jews. Yeah. Now they had they probably had not like intense, crazy, what we imagine on the Passion of the Christ, but he gets disciplined by other Jews for coming in with he's so passionate and so apocalyptic and so with this new Christ idea, he's getting in trouble. Right. And if we use him as an example and then just apply something like it, not saying it's the same, but like something like that with this very passionate, very religious, devout believer named Muhammad, and he comes in and he's kind of even debating with people on the ideas of scripture, he's going to create himself a problem. That will happen today. You can go in today, right now in London, I think they have this like park where people come and they debate and it's all they do. You can get in trouble real quick.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, the miracle, if you will, and I'm using this as a sort of secular term
No problem.
in the Prophet Muhammad's career is how does he then become the leader of Medina? How does that happen? And that's not very well explained, I think, in the sort of the seerah literature, so the biographical literature of the Prophet Muhammad. It's a historical sort of conundrum or question that not very good answers have been given to. So, I mean,
you have a personal take, because I'm thinking of like Constantine, and I'm seeing you have like Mithras, and then you have, or the worship of the sun, Mithra, and then you have Christianity, and this is a good political possible thing to get behind because of its ideas and how it really changes. I don't know. Maybe someone saw that passion and thought, this is someone we want to back up.
Yeah. I mean, according to this sort of conventional narrative, the Medinan tribes were feuding, and there were these, constant battles and blood feuds between them, and sort of the Prophet Muhammad comes there as sort of not only as a prophet and leader, but also sort of reconciles between the different tribes. So it seems that there was a good moment to step in, and he was like the right person at the right time. If you read the so-called Constitution of Medina. So this is a modern name to a text that is very different from modern constitutions, but it's a text, it's some sort of treaty text between different tribes of Medina. It invokes the authority of the Prophet Muhammad. So it's definitely something that is stipulated to a degree, at least, by the Prophet Muhammad. Probably also the partakers to that treaty had some say in how it was sort of phrased and formatted. But probably also is true that the Prophet Muhammad was the one having the final say about what this document will remark on different duties and rights of different tribes and religious groups as well. So it seems to me to be this great treaty text that really sort of acknowledges the different tribal identities, the different religious identities. So the Jews are mentioned there explicitly. Christians are never mentioned, which probably means that the Christian Medinan community was quite small. That's my hypothesis, at least. So it acknowledges that these, tribal identities can still exist within this new movement of followers. Also, people can be Jewish or Gentile believers as far as they acknowledge the authority of the Prophet Muhammad to a degree, and and believe in the one God and the last day, as the text says. So it's this brilliant document which seems to bring various Medinan tribes together, say that you can still retain your old identities, but here's a new one to you as well as believers, a mu'minun, one community, Ummah Wahida as they're called as well in the document. So it's quite remarkable. It doesn't mention all the tribes that we know, at least from the biographical sources, that inhabited Medina. So I don't know if there were other treaties with them, or they were not included in this document, in this treaty, but it's an amazing piece of documentary evidence.
I was encouraged by a few academics to read the earliest biography of Muhammad. I got it on Audible. Al-Jalad actually is like, hey, check this out, read it. And it goes into some of these treaties. I can't remember the name of the author of the earliest biography.
Well, the one by Ibn Hisham or Ibn Ishaq. It's Ibn Hisham is the later editor of Ibn Ishaq's work. That's one of the most famous ones. Then there's one by Al-Waqidi, for instance. And they're quite a few different.
My memory is never great. I would need to probably dig in to find that. But yeah, some of the stuff you're describing here about these issues between tribes and what happens, you were saying there seems to be more indication of less Jewish in Medina. And that was kind of described in that biography, because it seemed like Jews had a lot of land, a lot of property, a lot of control and power and money and things like that. And there was like struggles and definite clashes between these groups. But you said the miracle, right? Like, how did he go from this preacher in Mecca to control and power? And here we have this religion. And many Christians even think, what a miracle, from a persecuted group to a world religion. And, like everybody claims to have the miracle on their side. And I just think it's interesting. I love to study this stuff as history, coming from a secular angle, of course, but I really enjoy learning. It's fascinating to see how ideas and these movements become and change, and just seeing how humans behave and knowing our past is a fun thing to learn. Is there anything you didn't mention that you think is worth mentioning before we end this episode?
Well, I mean, the one thing that I find very interesting is what happens after the Prophet Muhammad's death. So when the so-called Muslim conquests start, they're called also Arab conquests by some people. And it would seem that this sort of fluid identity of still forming identity is still very much present during that period of conquest as well. And you have these various sources, which I discuss in the book, that both by Jews and Christians that mention some Jewish and Christian groups as being part of that movement that conquered much of the known world, and then also Jerusalem, and that seems to have been very important, especially for the Jewish followers in that moment of Jewish followers of the Prophet Muhammad. Of course, by that time, the Prophet Muhammad himself had died, at least according to the conventional dating. There are some scholars such as Stephen Shoemaker who have suggested that actually Muhammad lived on to see the conquest of Jerusalem. I don't really believe in that. I don't think good evidence for that. But still, like, it is actually amidst that sort of conquest period when the Prophet Muhammad's followers meet maybe more established Jewish and Christian communities, which had, quite clear structure, quite clear, religious identity, distinct identity, that they themselves start to form that sort of distinct identity that they start to call Islam at some point. But still during the conquest, there were some Jews and Christians taking part in those conquests. And it is especially the evidence that has been written by Jews and Christians themselves that seems to indicate this. So I think that's very fascinating and interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting. You have two groups, jumping back to the book of Acts, mentioned here, God-fearers and children of Abraham, or Israelites.
Yeah.
And eventually in Christian era, by the time Christianity and Christians is a solid identification, Jew, Greek, doesn't matter, you're Christian or you're pagan.
Yeah.
Now you have a new category being formed. So yeah, this is just an interesting thing to see how early on there seem to have been less restrictions, less identifying of who's who. And then over time, even Christians identifying other Christians as heretics, and you can't even agree. I imagine the Sunni Shia split. Oh, goodness gracious, right? We could get lost in that, and how it's just a human phenomena that happens everywhere, it seems.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the diversity of early Islam that you have, the fact that you have the Sunni Shia split and Ibadis and all these other groups and subgroups of them. I mean, I would say that one factor behind that is the diversity of backgrounds among the followers of the Prophet Muhammad during his lifetime and later. So you have people from pagan background, you have people from Jewish and Christian background coming to this movement and then, feeding, notions and debates into the sort of the emerging Islamic community.
Is it true to say that later materials have Muhammad saying things that other materials say the opposite, and there's definitely contradictory narratives of what Muhammad was for or against or said, and then in other cases he did say that no, that's wrong. Like you could see competition of ideas. I ask because when I look at Jesus and I see the Gospels, even in the New Testament are conflicting, but even more over time, as you get more and more Gospels, you get different, well, this is what really happened, or Jesus said this, and it really contradicts this thing over here. Do we see that in the material?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, the Hadith material in particular, which is sort of like a collection of a huge corpus of prophetic dicta and descriptions of the Prophet Muhammad's practices and what he did in certain, historical situation, and also what other early important figures did. So through these hadiths, these narratives about the Prophet Muhammad, a lot of like theological debate is being waged, and also when it comes to practices, what are the correct practices of being a Muslim? How do you pray? So the sort of the exemplary figure of the Prophet Muhammad is involved in these narratives, and often they are conflicting narratives. And the medieval scholars themselves were aware that there were forged hadiths, and even among the authentic ones, you have to reconcile the discrepancies somehow. And then, you maybe want to favor something that the Prophet Muhammad did later, because he might have changed his practices and mind. So through this hadith corpus, and this is a vast amount of text and very rich and interesting, I mean, there you can definitely see the different figures of the Prophet Muhammad as put forward as sort of like an example from the past, how the Muslims should act and think in the present.
Wow. There's so much. There is so much that we can talk about. And I really hope people learned quite a bit of things during this interview. I know I did, along this journey of learning from you. I know I need to read your book so we can get into the weeds of some of the things that you state in it. I hope viewers will also get the book. This has been just, again, I love history. I love learning this. It's been a pleasure really learning from you. And I hope that you enjoyed this as well. I hope the viewers enjoyed this. Comment your thoughts. What do you agree? What do you disagree? What is your view? I'm interested in hearing what your view is. But I also love learning from experts who specialize in getting into the languages, coming at it from a more, not a religious view necessarily, right? Doesn't mean if someone might be religious, but like coming at it, what I would say, with historical methodology. And what can we see? How can we assess this and compare it to the phenomena we know in the world? Anything else we missed that you might want to mention?
Well, I mean, we did not mention Yemen at all, but there's we mentioned in passing Yemen, but there's an interesting phase in the history of Yemen in late antiquity when at least the ruling dynasty and probably quite many inhabitants of ancient Yemen converted to Judaism. And that seems to me, at least, to have been quite a rare thing to happen. Of course, we know that people converted to Judaism, but on that grand scale, that a whole state more or less converts to Judaism, that's something to discuss in the future, perhaps.
We could do a deep dive on that. And this is roughly late antiquity. Is this 300, 400, 500 AD?
Yeah, this happens in the 4th century and later.
Okay, and this is around the time the Talmudic this is around the Babylonian Talmud and the other Talmud.
Palestinian Talmud.
Palestinian, yeah. So we probably need a deep dive into this. And also, I always have questions about what seems to be influence in early Quranic material, other material from Jewish material.
Right.
These are questions I like to explore and dive deeper into about, can we make genetic connections? Can we just say there's influence culturally? Like, I love to explore comparative mythology or comparative legend, myth, folklore, these kinds of things.
Right.
This is stuff I really enjoy the most. In fact, my channel is called MythVision for a reason. And it's because I want to look at mythology. I want to see, and when I use the word myth, I don't mean it just in like, what's a lie? I mean, myths. They teach us stories. They're not literally history, but there's depth. And sometimes behind them, there's a historical setting that inspires that story. Right. And so I like to dive deep into these things, and maybe we can explore that deeper and get into the Yemen Jewish conversions that happened. And what was the cause? Yeah. Sounds good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you so much for your time. Everybody, get the book, Muhammad and His Followers in Context. Let me make sure I got the entire title here. Muhammad and His Followers in Context, The Religious Map of Late Antique Arabia, Islamic History and Civilization 209. That link will be in the description. I know it's a hefty price, but if you're looking for an academic publication that dives deep into some of the most latest cutting edge material on this is a book you got to check out. We showed you one of the maps, where that map specifically is in this book.
Not that map. You can see the map on my academia.edu site if somebody is interested in that map. But there's some maps in the book as well. But yeah, this is something that I want to update and keep up to date, because the book is already published, and you can cover. I cover material that was published up to 2022 or thereabouts. So some new inscriptions have come to light since, so I include them in the map and the list of monotheist inscriptions from Saudi Arabia, or however that is titled.
Follow him on academia. I just did. So the link will be in the description for that as well on his academia page. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and let's do this again.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, Derek.
Thank you. Everyone, have a nice day.